Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Clementine Starling, Director of the Forward Defense Program at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. It is my pleasure to welcome you all in person and virtually to the launch of the report, The Sixth Domain, The Role of the Private Sector in Warfare, authored by Atlantic Council Distinguished Fellow and Board Director Frank Kramer. Today, we are honored to host Jen Easterly, Director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. Ms. Easterly will give keynote remarks on how the US government is engaging with and working alongside the private sector to develop secure infrastructure to counteract external threats and ensure US prosperity and national security. We're also joined by a panel of experts who will discuss ways in which policymakers can forge a more constructive public-private partnership for wartime and integrate the private sector as what Frank describes in his paper as the sixth operational domain. I would like to thank all of our speakers and you, our in-person and virtual audiences, for joining us for this discussion. So putting this event in context, I'd like to underscore who we are. The Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security works to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies and partners. The Scowcroft Center honors the legacy of service of General Brent Scowcroft and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for US leadership in cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. This afternoon's event exemplifies one of the ways we deliver on this mission. For some time, the United States and its allies have recognized 5 operational domains: air, land, maritime, cyberspace, and newly space. However, with a thriving commercial sector and the onset of new technologies and dual-use capabilities, the role of commercial actors in competition and conflict has really come to the fore. The ongoing Ukraine-Russia war has been a testament to the importance of the private sector offering key capabilities and services throughout the conflict. Whether these commercial companies are providing effective cybersecurity or maintaining working informational technology networks or a whole range of other things, these operational and coordinated activities have demonstrated an emerging sixth domain. In warfighting constructs, plans, preparations, and actions, the sixth domain needs to be taken into account if the United States and its allies are to prevail in competition or future conflict. Establishing an effective strategy for the private sector during warfare is essential, and that is what this report by Frank Kramer aims to accomplish. So in this context, we are excited to hear from Jen Easterly. In her role as director, Ms. Easterly leads CISA's efforts to understand, manage, and reduce risk for the cyber and physical infrastructure Americans rely on. Ms. Easterly previously served as the first global head of Morgan Stanley's Cybersecurity Fusion Center. She was a special assistant to President Obama and senior director for counterterrorism, as well as an executive assistant to National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice. She also served as the deputy for counterterrorism at the National Security Agency, so tons of experience. So after more than 20 years of service in intelligence and cyber operations, Ms. Easterly retired from the US Army as a 2-time recipient of the Bronze Star. So following Ms. Easterly's remarks, we'll have a moderated panel where we encourage our audience to post questions via askac.org. Please submit your questions there. We encourage you to identify yourself and your affiliation. We'll collect those questions throughout the event, and our fantastic moderator, Marjorie Sensor, editor at Defense News, will pose them to our panel. We also encourage you to follow at Atlantic Council and at AC Scowcroft on X to join the conversation. And with that, I will pass it over to Ms. Easterly for keynote remarks. Thank you so much.
Perfect. All right. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be able to kick off this important discussion on the critical role of the private sector in safeguarding the security of our nation. As many of you know, CISA is the newest agency in the federal government. We were stood up a little over 5 years ago to play 2 key roles. We serve as America's civilian cyber defense agency and as the national coordinator for critical infrastructure resilience and security. Our mission is to lead the national effort to understand, manage, and reduce risk to the cyber and physical infrastructure that Americans rely on every hour of every day. For water, for power, for transportation, for communication, for healthcare, for education, and so much more. In essence, we protect and defend the systems and the networks that power our daily lives. But as you know, the vast majority of that infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. And CISA is not a regulator, we're not a law enforcement agency, we're not an intel agency, we're not a military agency. We are a partnership agency. We operate by, with, and through partners. And our success is entirely predicated on our ability to catalyze trusted partnerships with our stakeholders, whether that's the private sector, colleagues across the federal government, or at the state and local level. And I'll say, while I spent 27 years in the government before this job, in the military, in the White House, in the intelligence community, the most important preparation for this job as director of CISA was the 4.5 years that I spent at Morgan Stanley, building and leading our Global Cybersecurity Fusion Center, and then serving as the firm's head of resilience. And being director of CISA has only reinforced how absolutely critical the private sector is to the security of our nation in both peacetime and in wartime, something that the report highlights, and why I was excited to be here with you today and provide a few framing thoughts to this idea of the sixth domain and the role of the private sector. Broadly, I really appreciated the thoughtful recommendations, and I'm not going to go through each, but I do want to highlight a few that really resonated most strongly, particularly given work that is ongoing at CISA. First, in some ways, the key recommendation around the establishment of a critical infrastructure wartime planning and operations council builds upon the excellent work of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, in particular, its recognition of the need for a joint cyber planning office, which we actually established in August of 21 as the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, or JCDC. Now, some may discount what a transformational idea the Joint Cyber Planning Office was, a many-to-many platform for information sharing and cyber defense planning and operations between the government and the private sector. And as we've evolved the JCDC, we've encountered not unexpected complexity, stemming from companies who compete on business not always wanting to work together on security, or companies who make money off selling threat intelligence who see what's provided by the JCDC for free as undercutting their business model, or companies that are used to working with the government through lawyers or through government affairs, now being asked to bring their technical and their operational folks to the table as well. And of course, we're asking companies to shift their focus. We want companies to actively join us in planning for incidents, not just in responding to them. The good news is, though, over the past 3 years, we have worked to overcome these natural pockets of friction and forged an increasingly effective model for multilateral sharing of cyber threat info and for cyber defense planning. The JCDC is now over 320 companies. It has 39 distinct communications channels with industry on specific priorities and lines of effort. Each channel is about 54 participants, which helps maintain the trust that is necessary to work between government and the private sector, although there are more participants in channels like threat intel or ransomware. But JCDC's published 93 joint products, including cybersecurity advisors, alerts, guides, fact sheets, increasingly, and this is very important, with private sector enrichment, and has produced 14 cyber defense plans to date focused on how the cybersecurity community will work together to defend against specific threats and strengthen the cybersecurity posture of particular critical infrastructure sectors or subsectors. Now, I emphasize this work because even though Frank didn't refer to it specifically as a critical infrastructure wartime planning and operations council, we've been leveraging the JCDC to play key aspects of that role. And we first called upon the JCDC in this way in late 2021, when indications of a Russian invasion of Ukraine sparked concern that Russia would consider initiating retaliatory cyber attacks on U.S. critical infrastructure for U.S. support to Ukraine. In January of 2022, 22 companies and 8 U.S. government agencies came together to develop a multi-phase plan to address possible Russian attacks on U.S. critical infrastructure. And the result was a 20-page plan which laid out 5 operational phases aligning to 8 planning objectives with specific lines of effort and actions and thresholds for activation, all of which were exercised in an extensive tabletop effort that fed into our broader Shields Up effort. And while we thankfully did not experience major retaliatory attacks, the mere act of planning and exercising across government and industry was incredibly valuable. As General Eisenhower once said, plans are nothing, planning is everything. Now today, our sights are set on China. We're working with government and industry partners to understand and mitigate risk to our critical infrastructure from Chinese cyber actors, known broadly as Volt Typhoon. They're intent on unleashing mass disruption on the U.S. in the event of a major conflict to induce societal panic and to deter our ability to marshal military might and citizen will. CISA teams are continuing to partner with critical infrastructure entities in the private sector to hunt for these actors on multiple sectors, including power and aviation and water and communications and transportation. And we've had success in detecting and eradicating these PRC Volt Typhoon actors. And what we found leaves us deeply concerned about widespread PRC Chinese cyber actor pre-positioning on our critical infrastructure. The PRC appears to be pursuing an everything, everywhere, all at once approach that would allow it to disrupt multiple critical infrastructure sectors simultaneously. Now, defending against and preparing for that possibility will require a nationwide effort to improve security, to build resilience, and to ensure we have the playbooks in place, in particular with the private sector, if such a mass disruption scenario does come to pass. And as was shown to be the case in 2022, the value of such efforts is not the actual plan, because we know that no plan meets contact with the adversary, but the planning itself, bringing in companies and government together to talk through preparation, to exercise response and continuity and recovery and communications is really fundamental to the cyber defense and resilience of our nation. And we have to exercise in peace to be ready in crisis. And that's what the JCDC is focused on overall, working with critical infrastructure owners and operators from specific sectors, as well as subsectors and their industrial control systems and SCADA vendors to build and execute network defense and resilience plans aimed at ensuring that these networks can continue to operate in the face of the Volt Typhoon threat. Now, as we've been evolving the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, we've also been building regional resilience collaboratives, which is, of course, consonant with another one of the report's key recommendations. Now, CISA's existing regional footprint is based around 10 national regional offices associated with field staff of cybersecurity advisors, protective security advisors with physical security expertise, local information sharing and coordination mechanisms with state and local partners, and with businesses large and small across the country. And while they're not presently focused exclusively on wartime planning, our regional model, as well as FEMA's and those of other federal agencies, is now focused on building national preparedness and emergency management for all hazards. So today, with our partners at DoD and FEMA, we're working to retune the system from the post-9/11 and Hurricane Katrina focus on terrorism and natural disasters to better serve this era of geopolitical tensions and persistent cyber threats. And the good news is that our regional resilience architecture is flexible and can adapt to meet those challenges. And those resilience efforts are not just focused on ensuring the safety and security of our civilian critical infrastructure, but also in supporting our partners in the U.S. military. At the more operational level of regional collaboration, we've been leading an effort known as the Critical Infrastructure Resilience Planning Areas Initiative, or CIRPA, which we actually started last year at the request of the Department of Defense. And it really builds on our longstanding cooperation with DoD, including the National Guard and civilian emergency management community. And it's focused on organizing and executing truly collaborative intergovernmental and public-private sector field work to reduce risk to and enhance the resilience of defense critical infrastructure, or DCI. These are systems that are determined by DoD to be essential to perform its mission, though DoD sometimes has limited insight into the security and resilience of the civilian critical infrastructure that are enablers of the defense critical infrastructure. And this is one reason why Congress codified CISA's role when they built the statute of National Coordinator for Critical Infrastructure Resilience and Security. It's really a role that helps to manage and reduce cross-sector risks, and that will actually be reinforced in the updated version of Presidential Policy Directive 21, which will be released by the administration in the near future. Just in the past few weeks, we've expanded the CIRPA work that I mentioned in additional locations strategically significant to Indo-PACOM and to NORTHCOM, and in the coming months, we're going to continue rolling out projects across other key locations in the country, engaging the private sector closely during steady state, but more importantly, preparing them to protect key assets in the event of heightened geopolitical tensions or war. Now, I know folks are excited to hear from the panel, so I'm just going to touch on two other recommendations in the report. First, the idea of a cadre of cybersecurity advisors. At CISA, we've had a lot of discussions about this in particular, ensuring that we have the capability and capacity to respond to mass cyber-enabled disruption or destruction of systemically important critical infrastructure entities. And while we are a new agency, we're continuing to evolve that capability to support critical infrastructure partners with hunting, with incident response services. And there are existing and also potentially new and novel ways we can use the Defense Production Act and the National Emergencies Act authorities for leveraging private sector incident response providers in extremis in wartime. And we're exploring these existing policy tools to determine how to apply them in new areas of risk. Separately to the recommendation on DoD hunt-forward operations for U.S. critical infrastructure, I did want to take the opportunity to highlight a capability that's truly one of our world-class teams that we don't often talk about. And indeed, even as our teammates in Cybercom at the Cyber National Mission Force have been growing their hunt-forward teams to engage with partners overseas, CISA has been at the same time growing our own threat hunt teams to engage with partners here at home. So bolstered by authorities in the budget that we've received over the last 3 years, these hunt teams have actually conducted 97 engagements in FY23 alone, and that's across federal, state, local, and private sector critical infrastructure entities across multiple sectors: communication, water, power, transportation. And these engagements have allowed our teams to evict nation-state actors from China, Russia, Iran, from American networks, also rapidly share that information to protect other victims, release impactful public advisories that drive risk reduction at scale, and enable our U.S. government partners, including, of course, the Department of Defense, to take action more effectively against our adversaries. And if needed, we have a mechanism in place to request technical assistance from Cyber National Mission Force teams under the Defense Support to Civil Authorities. So just a few closing thoughts about mutual expectations around operating effectively in the sixth domain. Just as the private sector should expect the U.S. government to be coherent, to be responsive, to be transparent, and to always add value, not friction. In particular, critical infrastructure owners and operators, as part of the private sector, they should be expected to regularly collaborate and share with government to recognize that a threat to one is a threat to many. CEOs and boards have to treat security risk as a business risk, as a matter of good governance, requiring significant investments in resilience. And finally, the burden of securing our infrastructure can't fall to CISA and the cybersecurity community alone. Technology underpins our nation's critical infrastructure in the economy, and it brings incredible connectivity to fuel innovation and ideas and production and service delivery, but much of our technology is dangerously insecure at time of sale, and that enables infrastructure that is very vulnerable to intrusions from our adversaries. That's why technology manufacturers themselves have to assume responsibility for securing their products from the design and development phases, and that's in line with the National Cybersecurity Strategy and the work that CISA has been doing on Secure by Design Revolution, which seeks to drive the adoption of principles outlined to ensure that technology products are designed and built and tested and deployed so that they can be reasonably protected against malicious cyber actors. And this is one of our highest priorities, something that we are heavily engaged on a daily basis with our private sector colleagues that create these technology products. So with that, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be able to introduce the great report and frame today's discussion. I really look forward to hearing how it goes, and moreover, I look forward to continued partnership and collaboration with the Atlantic Council and with all of you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much to Jen Easterly for setting us up. If the panel would join me on stage, we'll move to the next section. All right. I'll just take a minute and introduce myself and our panel. I'm Marjorie Sensor. I'm the editor of Defense News, and we have a great lineup today. Franklin Kramer, who's the author of the report that we're going to be discussing, and Distinguished Fellow and Board Director at the Atlantic Council. And we have Leonore Tamaro, Vice President of Government Relations at J.A. Green & Company, Greg Little, Senior Counselor at Palantir Technologies, and Emma Schrader, Associate Director of the Cyber Statecraft Initiative here at the Atlantic Council. So thank you all for joining me, and I'm looking forward to a great conversation. But I was hoping, Frank, you could start us off by giving us a brief overview of your report and maybe focusing also on what you think the top recommendations are.
Well, first of all, thanks very much. I think the first thing I want to say is that was a terrific presentation by Jen. It really bears repeating and listening to closely. And I think she's taken, with a lot of help, she's taken that agency a long, long way. So hats off to her. The report obviously is called The Sixth Domain, as was said by Clementine. The idea was to not just focus on the 5 areas that are well known, air, land, sea, cyberspace, but to think hard about the role of the private sector in wartime. And it's an operational role that we're talking about, because we've always had an industrial base, we've always had logistics support, but now we see, and particularly in the context of Ukraine, we see companies providing cybersecurity in the fight, Microsoft and many others, ESET. We see companies providing capabilities from space, whether it's communications like Starlink or imagery, Planet, Max Archipelago. We see companies bringing things together, if you will, artificial intelligence analysis, Palantir. We have one of the Palantir people right here on the panel. And that's different. It's right in the context of what has to go on in wartime, as opposed to, if you will, behind the lines or support. So the major recommendation, and Jen already said it, is to establish an institutional framework that would create an effective approach to engagement with the private sector during wartime. The paper is written in the context of the United States, but applies equally to our allies, whether in Europe and NATO or in the Indo-Pacific. And again, as Jen listed, the whole point is to do planning. Planning in advance, exercising, training, making sure that the people who have to work together know one another, that there's a high degree of trust, and they've thought through the problems, or the best they can, with respect to the problems that might actually exist. And we know, and she pointed out, we know that the PRC, the Chinese, are already in our infrastructure. We know because the Director of National Intelligence has said on multiple occasions, if there were a war with China, the Chinese would attack our critical infrastructures. Well, the whole country relies on the critical infrastructures. The military does, but so do all of us. And so we need to keep those going. And of course, we see in the context of Ukraine, Russia attacking the critical infrastructures every day. So the question would become, what do we really do in terms of planning? Because it's a big country, and we can't protect everything all at once, or certainly not initially. There are two ideas in the report as a way to start. One Jen referred to, which was to think hard about what are the critical infrastructures most important to supporting defense activities. So those would be air, rail, ports, electric grid, pipelines, perhaps some others. Another way is to look at what are called Section 9 entities. And those are companies whose stopping of their operations would be catastrophic to the economy. They are not, CISA analyzes which of those, the actual companies' names are not public, but the fact of Section 9 is public. So putting that together would give a very good starting place. And then the question is, okay, how do you really do it? So we have a lot of capabilities in the country. What the report is suggesting is formalizing some of these things, adding to, for example, some of the things that CISA is doing. So one thing we called it an integrated cybersecurity providers core, and you can tell I come from the Defense Department because I have completely clunky suggestions of what something would be called. But the idea would be highly capable cybersecurity providers linked up, actually working side by side on a regular basis with the critical infrastructures that were identified, knowing their systems so that if something happened, it's not starting from scratch, but we really know what's going on. We each trust one another, we've worked together and the like. The second is to expand the personnel that are available. So a cyber civilian reserve corps. Now in the UK, United Kingdom, they have one. They've identified people who have cyber capabilities. It's not a military group, it's a group that's focused on cyber capabilities as opposed to in the military you have to have certain physical capabilities. Estonia has a similar one. Another way to do this is to expand the National Guard. National Guard has some terrific cybersecurity units. In my opinion, they ought to have more people and more units. And then Jen mentioned Cyber Command hunt forward. Cyber Command doesn't hunt back now. CISA does, as she pointed out, but Cyber Command could add to that capability in wartime, and only in wartime, because I think broadly speaking in peacetime we want to keep the military forward, but in war it's appropriate for the military to defend the country. And the last thing I'd mention is there's an awful lot of information and a lot of energy that flows under the water, undersea. So the report suggested let's create an undersea protection corps focused on the cables. That could be transatlantic cables or focused on the pipelines. There are hundreds of pipelines in the Baltic Sea, for example, supporting Europe, energy pipelines. And we've seen problems with them. Around Taiwan, for example, several of the cables have been cut. In the Baltic Sea, Nord Stream 2 was blown up, if you will. So the idea is to bring together people who can work on the undersea. Now, NATO has actually started that, but it's a sharing operation. And the recommendation in the report, again, is to bring together key countries with good undersea capabilities like the US, UK, France, Norway, with the owners and operators of the cables and pipelines, and then with companies that actually can do repair. So let me stop there and turn it over to panel and be delighted to hear what you all think.
That's a great start. Thanks, Frank. I think what seems to be coming up again and again is the role that the war in Russia, or Russia's war in Ukraine, the lessons learned that are relevant here, and I think that might be a good place to start. Emma, would you like to talk a little bit about how that has influenced the thinking here?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that I think is important to note about this conflict is it's somewhat the first time that we're seeing a lot of these patterns emerge. And with that being said, that means that it's both a very valuable opportunity for us to learn, but also it is, it's just one sort of case that we're pulling from. So we're seeing, in this environment, a kind of changing pattern over the last couple of years, especially when we look at the activity of the private sector involved, and also the actions that both the U.S. government and allied governments have taken kind of in response and alongside that. So, looking at the beginning of the conflict, we saw very much the pattern of involvement was this sort of ad hoc direct engagement. We saw both direct kind of reach outs from the Ukrainian government to private companies, not only through these kind of direct channels that they have, but also straight on social media, saying, hey, we know that we need this capability, you have it, why don't you give it to us? Which was a very interesting way to get things done. Clearly, things moved very fast. They were able to identify, we want this technology, we think we can integrate it, let's go, Yeah. And I think what we have sort of seen over the past couple of years is that, yes, that is an effective strategy of kind of getting these technologies, but oftentimes what seems to be somewhat missing is a way to track what is being sent, track how it's being used, and also make sure that we're kind of coordinating across private companies and allied states to say, are we making sure that what Ukraine is getting is the most effective piece of technology, the most effective service that's possible? And so we're moving a little bit more towards saying, I think we need a couple more mechanisms in here to track, do we know exactly what tools Ukraine is getting, and do they work together? Do we know they've gotten this tool and actually it didn't really work out? Do we know why? So we're seeing a lot of different efforts here. Obviously, the Talon mechanism and the IT coalition are recently emerging very much with that focus of we need some overarching understanding of the patterns here in order to, as is outlined in this report, we need to provide effective aid that is kind of coherently organized across both the public and private sectors.
Yeah. Anybody else want to chime in here? We can keep going. Maybe to you, Greg, as a representative of the private sector here, can you talk a little bit about the logistics, the potential barriers to kind of making progress in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I want to commend Frank on writing this report. I thought it was incredible. I think highlighting the sixth domain, the importance of the private sector in warfare, became obvious in the Russia-Ukraine war. I think you astutely point out, Frank, in your report, whether it's cyber or AI or software or cloud computing, just the importance of that to Ukraine. In a lot of ways, it was a David and Goliath thing, and we gave Ukraine, who's considered David, a sling in a lot of ways. One of the reasons why I'm so excited about also Frank's report is there's a pragmatic reason for the U.S. If you think about from World War II to the Cold War, a lot of the R&D spending, a lot of the technical innovation was actually coming out of government. When the Cold War ended, you saw a lot of consolidation. You saw a peace dividend, budgets shrank. That famous 1993 Last Supper. And a lot of the innovation is now in commercial, and a lot of the R&D spending is now in commercial. And so if you think about our competitive advantage in the United States, it really is our technical capabilities in software and AI and space. And so the more we can use those capabilities and have a part of national security and planning for that today, the better. And so, I thought, Frank, it was an incredible report and one that's very pragmatic for us to be starting. In terms of the barriers, let me first be a little bullish and not just be the industry person that's always negative about government, maybe because I was in government for a long time. But let me talk about some bullish things. If you look at venture capital, they're really stepping up to the plate. About $100 billion over the last 3 years invested in national security and defense. That's 40% more than the 7 previous years. If you look at more non-traditional, they're starting to get into the field. We, Palantir, were able to get into Titan, the first sort of software integrator. Anduril was just announced yesterday being part of the collaborative combat aircraft. And so I'm seeing a really interesting shift there. If you look at the industrial policy that came out of DoD, very commercial-centric in a lot of ways. To Emma's point, though, I think there are some things that we need to be thinking about. One is that, we have to sort of, government still likes this idea of owning intellectual property. And that is a big barrier if we want more commercial companies coming in. So should government own data rights? Absolutely, but probably won't own the intellectual property. We have to think about accreditation and speed to actually getting these capabilities in the hands of the warfighter. That is still taking way too long to be able to happen. In the department, I would say national security, we still have this build versus buy mentality. I think if we want to be able to scale and leverage commercial sector, we have to start getting used to buying more of this technology than trying to build it ourselves, because to Frank's report, speed matters. I mean, these are real threats. The last thing I will say is, like, the Department of National Security loves buying hardware, loves buying big platforms. It takes forever. Well, I think what we've learned in Ukraine, and again, Frank hits this, is that it's the asymmetric threats that really matter. And so software represents only about 1% of the DoD budget. And so if we could just put software on an equal pedestal of hardware, that would be really nice, considering software is one of our big competitive advantages. So again, I'm bullish, but I think there's things that we need to speed up, especially as we think of 2027 and the real threats from China and what we're seeing in the Middle East and Europe.
Yeah. And Leonore, maybe you can speak a little bit, as a former government official, about the space industry, which I think has really been highlighted in this particular conflict. What sort of opportunity does it present, in terms of what we've seen in that war so far?
Yeah, I think a lot of the commercial innovation and private sector transformation has been seen in space and has had a huge impact on deterrence. First we've seen lowering the cost of launch and access to space, and that was really thanks to SpaceX introducing the notion of just cheaper launch, reusable boosters, which for a long time folks were saying, can't be done. So that new access to space and making launch a lot cheaper has allowed a lot more commercial access to put satellites in space. And the other piece is another example, again, are the mega constellations going up in space at the proliferated low Earth orbit that are providing very resilient satellite communications. And so this is launching, thousands of small satellites that create a mesh network. And so you're seeing that with the Starlink satellites that SpaceX is putting up. They first launched their first 60 in 2019. They're up to 6,000 right now, which constitute half of the man-made satellites in space. And you're seeing other competitors joining that model, Amazon's Project Kuiper, for example, or Eutelsat and OneWeb's constellation. And so that transformation and allowing a lot more resilience in space is having a huge impact on deterrence.
I know one thing the panel we talked about as we were preparing was General Van Herk and his comments, his concern about protecting the homeland and particularly critical infrastructure. And maybe you want to start us off, Frank, by are you hearing more of an acceptance from the government of what needs to be done, and then what are you hearing from industry? Obviously, it's a two-way street here.
I think the government, and in particular the DoD, is really starting to think this through, and the general's comments are the front end of a conversation. So just to give you one example, we have what's called Northern Command, which broadly speaking is in charge of the so-called Homeland Defense. Northern Command has a limited cyber capability, not zero, but limited. We have a Cyber Command, which broadly speaking mostly looks outside, although it does have internal capabilities. Trying to bring those two together, for example, how would one work the arrangements between commands is an important effort that is yet to be done. Everyone knows it needs to be done, but here we are sorting it out. Jen Easterly pointed out that in the last, and I'm not exactly sure when they started, but in the last year or so, a little bit more than that, I guess, CISA is now actually doing hunt operations. That's new. It's terrific. We have other capabilities to do hunt operations. The private sector has hunt operations capabilities. DoD has hunt operations capabilities. And then in a different context, the FBI has some capabilities also. Again, integrating those kinds of things are enormously important. We need to look at, again, space sets of issues, constellations, as was pointed out. The proliferation of the low Earth orbit constellations is highly resilient because up to now, when I say now, in the last few years, most of our important things are what are called geosynchronous orbit, way up. But there are very few of them, so they become susceptible to attack. When you proliferate, it makes it less susceptible, and especially if you can launch. But then a couple weeks ago, or maybe it's a couple months ago now, we heard about Russians thinking about putting nuclear weapons in space. There's an effect that's called electromagnetic pulse, which essentially sends out electromagnetic pulses and those would sort of burn out circuits. So you can defend against that. You can build in capabilities against EMP. Private sector probably wouldn't do that on its own, but you could have the Defense Department hypothetically provide some funding to do that for at least select amounts. The DoD works with airlines to have them, civilian airlines, provide transport support if necessary during wartime. It's called the Civilian Reserve Air Fleet. The Space Command is thinking about those kinds of things with the private sector. So there's a lot to be done along those lines, and I think you could make a much longer list, but that just gives some ideas.
I think just to jump in on the importance of resilience and the important role of the commercial sector in building resilience is you've got different layers, right? You can have the unclassified, very easily shareable data that can be shared publicly, and I think we saw very good examples of that in the context of the war on Ukraine, for example. Frank, you mentioned Capella Space. One of, again, 10 years ago, there weren't any commercial synthetic aperture radar companies. So it's, companies that are providing space-based imagery that can see through clouds, that can see at night. And those had been in the purview of the government. These had been, IC intelligence satellites. But now, again, with the access to space and much smaller satellites, this is a lot more affordable. And these images are low cost, are unclassified, they're near real time. And you saw that in the war in Ukraine, where it was the Capella satellites that showed, the lines of Russian tanks rolling into Ukraine. And that has really increased deterrence in that we can hold adversaries accountable. This has introduced a lot of transparency, and that, you can defeat propaganda by being able to show these images to the world in real time.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up General Van Herk. I think he's going to be an important figure in history for two reasons. One, he was one of the main voices that was raising concerns about the homeland, and one of the major reasons why it's in the National Defense Strategy. The second reason is I think he actually was very much a thought leader in integrated deterrence and how to make that real. And really what he was attempting to do was weave three things together. How do I have the right domain and threat awareness? So when I'm making decisions, it's not minutes or hours, it's days and weeks. So he has decision space to be able to deter or deny that threat. The second piece is he thought about integrated collaboration. And what I mean by that is he didn't think of the typical way I think DoD thinks of things of like you just have Indo-Pacific, you just have CENTCOM, or you just have the military. What he was really thinking about was how do I communicate globally across the joint U.S. force? How do I think about my allies and partners? How do I think about CISA? How do I think about DHS? And how do I integrate that so I have a complete picture and I'm doing the right response and contributing in the right way? The third thing he did that was really important is he realized in order to have decision advantage, I need better and faster awareness and be able to take better and faster actions than my adversary. The only way to do that is through software and AI. And he was one of the first adopters of using this technology, and he established this thing called the Global Information Dominance Experimentation. And in essence, the premise is the only way you'll learn new doctrine like global integration, the only way you'll explore new technologies is by doing. And I think the DoD is currently on Guide 9. This was started 5 years ago, but every 4 months, the department goes through these mission workflows and actually tests out how it'll fight, so it'll actually be prepared for this global threat, whether it's domestic or international. And I think with a peer adversary like China, it will be a global threat. It won't be in an isolated region, and it won't be an isolated domain.
Yeah. Emma, did you want to add into that or keep moving?
Yeah, I think I'll just kind of going off the last thing that you said, talking about planning being practice, again, referring back to Director Easterly's comments as well. I think we see that across this space. We're looking at cooperation with the private sector as well. JCDC has been building up very important relationships with the private sector that, even though obviously they're directed towards the protection of the homeland, critical infrastructure, those relationships themselves and the practice of that communication is incredibly important. We see that echoed in cooperation with our allies and cooperation across this space.
Yeah. I want to make sure we get some audience questions in. As a reminder, whether you're virtual or in the room, use askac.org to ask questions, and I'll be able to see them. So let's give it a go here. How do you incentivize the private sector to engage in the sometimes Byzantine arrangements that exist within the federal government? Anyone?
So I'll take that from let me take it from a kind of a, this will sound a little ideological, and then then I'll get to like a more probably practical business sense.
Okay.
I think if you look at where we are right now in the world, I mean, you could argue that World War III has already started. You have conflict in the Middle East, you have conflict in Europe, there's tensions in the Indo-Pacific. It's a dangerous place. I think more and more Americans and American companies are realizing that. You're actually seeing a really big influx of new technology companies and existing technologies starting to get into defense. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a very pragmatic and practical and sort of civic duty thing that you're actually seeing come in real life, which is really good to see. I also think there's from a business sense, I think the department is doing, and national security apparatus as all, is doing a large demand signal to industry to be able to come in and make it easier to be able to get in. And if that happens, you're going to start seeing what we're seeing now with venture capitalists and private money being able to help accelerate that, with not only to be able to protect our Western values, but also to be able to return on their investment. And so I think both things are happening right now, where I don't think that really existed 5 or 6 years ago. And it wasn't, a lot of tech companies were scared of coming into national security. I think the Russia-Ukraine war, if there's any silver lining, they realized that they have to be part of this narrative. And I think the demand signals are starting to come there on the business side as well.
Could I just
Yeah,
add?
of course.
So one of the in fact, the newest set of commands are the Space Command of the Space Force. And one of the benefits of being new is you can try out new things. So they've made terrific strides in terms of interacting with the commercial sector. And they've just actually written, the DoD has written a commercial space strategy, and then Space Force wrote a Space Force commercial strategy. So they're really reaching out. And they're using all different kinds of mechanisms, and there are mechanisms out there to use. So, for example, there's an organization called Defense Innovation Unit, which is does go out and look for new and interesting commercial capabilities. There are authorities inside the Department of Defense acquisition system. One is called Other Transactional Authority. Without getting into what it is, it allows for simplified acquisitions. So we've got some interest, exemplified, for example, by Space Command, Space Force, which I think is resonating with the other services as they see what's possible. We have some specialized organizations looking for things, and we have some capabilities that the Congress has authorized. So it's a question of putting it all together in a useful way. We're early days, but we're not nowhere. We're past the start line. And I think we need to really expand out. And one of the things, of course, which I don't think we've used the words unmanned vehicles yet in this meeting, but we've seen in Ukraine a tremendous amount of drones, unmanned vehicles, various kinds. And that's a whole world also, which commercial capabilities will provide enormous approaches at a low cost but high effectiveness.
Yep. I'd also maybe jump in to say, I would flip the question on its head a bit and say, I think the government needs to, and in general, better understand the incentives that allowed private companies to make that decision to say we're going to get involved in Ukraine in this type of way. I think we are already seeing that the ways in which the private company is engaging in Ukraine is not going to be the same in any other conflict, any future conflicts. So we need to really understand and break down kind of what are those factors that are driving, in the boardroom, in the kind of places where the decisions are actually made, beyond the headlines. What are the factors that are driving, creating incentives for companies to say, this is actually a thing that we want to be doing? And how can the US government better, and allied governments better understand those incentives and say, is there a way that we can build those up? We can encourage this activity. Obviously, this is not going to be an environment which the US government can say, hey, you company, you are going to, for free, provide this because it's good for our allied state. But rather kind of understanding these driving forces who can better shape them in the future.
Yeah.
And I would say, just to add to that piece, I think 3 things that the government should be doing more of, I think is starting to, and we're seeing pockets, right, with Defense Innovative Unit and within the Space Force, with Space Development Agency, for example, and the Commercial Space Office, where they're really forward-leaning in terms of leveraging commercial technology and integrating that technology quickly, is speed, is being able to act quickly, put companies on contract quickly, I think is key. But related to speeding up acquisition is accelerate the requirements process. So for the Department of Defense to be able to acquire certain capabilities, they rely on establishing requirements, and that can sometimes take a while. And so I think accelerating the requirements process is a key piece, in addition to prioritizing more funding for commercial capabilities and new models. For example, using data as a service. So buying things as a service versus buying hardware or developing the software themselves.
I know we're running out of time, and so I just want to fit in one more, which actually is a question I wanted to ask too, which is how should the United States work with allied and partner countries and companies in the private domain? Because you mentioned the allied piece too, so maybe we can get to that very quickly.
Well, the short answer to that is as much as possible. The longer answer to that is that it's probably much easier to do it on a bilateral basis with certain kinds of countries that we have close relations. And the perfect example, of course, is UK, or the group that's called Five Eyes, which are countries that we share highly sensitive intelligence with. But we need to do that throughout NATO. And NATO has, which is a big organization, moves slowly, 32 countries now, has started to think hard about that space sets of activities. But I would suggest in the DoD, and everyone here knows the phrase crawl, walk, run. So let's start with a few that we can work closely with, and then expand out would be my suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, like AUKUS is a great example of what we're doing there. Again, I'm a big believer in the field to learn approach, and so that's why I'm bullish on things like GUIDE, the Global Information Dominance Experimentation, is that we all need to know that this will be an integrated response, and we need to be able to have the right coalition of forces to be able to resist our adversaries. And so the more we can practice this, the better our doctrine will be, but also the better we'll figure out what technologies to use and what companies can be able to provide that. And so the more of that type of stuff we can do and get prepared early, I think is a really important thing.
And I think this is a key element, right? That's in terms of our competitive advantage against Russia and China is our private sector innovation, but it's our strong alliances. And so combining those together can really strengthen, really is the basis of our deterrence capabilities.
There's some really great questions coming in, but we are unfortunately out of time. So I just want to thank our excellent panel and our opener, Jen Easterly. Thank you all for coming and for the excellent discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.